freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Hello, Truth Transistors. To call this video Black Lives Matter, What Would Jesus Do? Now, we live in a very divided world right now. One of the signs of the last days is that the hearts of many will grow cold. Now, there's always been division in the world. There's always been problems and wars. So no, I'm not here proclaiming that we're in the last days, but, we're seeing something that could be a sign, and it could pick up even more so. But the question of this video is it's not about the last days, it's more about how should a Christian respond to these things that are going on. And one of the things I believe of the left-right paradigm, which I have left, no, I'm not in the left. I left the left-right paradigm. I got out of the left-right paradigm about 12 years ago, as I started to see how it's just a show and it's all rhetoric, and there's really, when it comes to important issues, there's really not much different between Democrats and Republicans. Now, that doesn't mean I don't have my views. Just to put it simply, what Ron Paul said is pretty much what I believe. So you can watch any of his videos or read his books to get an idea of my view. But I used to be a staunch Republican. I used to be a Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity supporter. That used to be me, and I used to be sort of on that polarized thinking. Now, I remember back in 2015, there was a series of police shootings that were on social media towards African American males. And I believe that's when the Black Lives Matter movement started. And I remember back then that it seemed unusual, like it had been a long time since we saw that much. Now, that doesn't mean that police brutality was not happening or racist things like that, but I didn't remember a whole lot of it, going back to maybe Rodney King, and then all of a sudden you had several in a row. And that could be partially because we have cell phones now and anything can be captured at any time, which has its good points. I mean, if it weeds out police brutality, that could be a good thing. The lack of privacy could also be a negative thing, but in this sense, it could be a good thing. But I remember the Black Lives Matter movement began, and I was already out of the left-right paradigm at that point. I remember the Colin Kaepernick response and him kneeling at the national anthem. And all of a sudden, it seems like people on the right were up in arms and offended by that, and that he's against our troops, and it's rude, and he's unpatriotic, un-American. And, he told the media why he was doing it. He said it was all about the police brutality, and he was making a protest. And I never had a problem with his line of protest. I supported that 100%. Even though I wasn't sure how bad the problem was, if it was exaggerated or what have you, I don't know. But I totally thought that was appropriate. And partially because I do not idolize our flag. and my nation is not on this earth, so I don't take that personally, and I don't, even having been awake for several years. Of course, that's a trigger word now. They say woke is some, I don't know. It's hard to say anything without just meaning the plain meaning of the words these days. But I'd been out of the left right paradigm for several years by that point, and I just started to see that was one example where I saw everybody on Fox News was ridiculing the kneeling and offended by the kneeling. And I also saw on the left how it became a case where in every shooting, Fox News always seemed to side with the cop or defend the cop, and the left always seemed to defend the person under arrest. And I think every case is unique. And so I think it's wrong to just always side with one side or the other. And that's something that I saw back then. How the political left right paradigm always seems to go one way. Now, I can't tell you over the last few years, since around 2016, if there have been many or any. I don't remember any until George Floyd. And so all of a sudden, this became huge news, and then the protesting started again. I forgot to mention that I remember back in Baltimore there were some violent riots and things, and this time the protests have picked up, and the kneeling idea has become more favorable. I remember the NFL was staunchly, I can't remember if it was the NFL or if every team decided to rule against it. I don't remember exactly, but now Roger Goodell seems to be open to allowing people to kneel or allowing the teams to decide. I don't remember, but that's probably the first thing ever that I've agreed with Roger Goodell on something. So for whatever reason in this country, because we are divided in a left-right paradigm, we can't seem to agree on the most obvious of things, the simplest issues that I think, unless you're a white supremacist, you would want to support. But on the right, there's always an and but, and that's what I've started to notice. There's two phrases. One is Black Lives Matter, and the other is All Lives Matter. And I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I said the statement All Lives Matter, but I didn't even realize that was a thing on Fox News because I don't really get my information from the mainstream media anymore by that point. So I remember on Facebook posting that, and then later found out this was a common thing on Fox News. And I stopped using that, not because I disagree that, not because I've changed my mind that all lives matter. It's just that I've realized that's a trigger phrase. And I'm trying to avoid trigger phrases. I'm trying to avoid things that have become commonplace amongst a left-right paradigm. And that's becoming difficult to do. So using this example on the phrases Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, it seems to be an all or nothing in both parties. And to the right, the term Black Lives Matter seems to always have negative connotations. And even though they would all say they agree with the phrase, when you watch Fox News, they never have. I don't remember Fox News ever or any of those conservatives saying anything positive about it. Not one thing. And on the other hand, when people say all lives matter, that triggers people on the left, and they can't. For some reason, the phrase all lives matter to them means that you don't care about black people. You support the cops even when they, so you're a racist, and this is what, it's not. I know it's not what a person means when they say all lives matter. They mean something, and they're trying to express themselves. But this is what it means to people on the left, just like Black Lives Matter means liberalism and communism and all kinds of things that I would say in the movement has been the movement itself that started out as a grassroots movement for civil rights has been hijacked. And the same thing happened with the Tea Party, as I believe started with the Ron Paul Liberty movement back in 2007. the first time he ran as a Republican, and the Tea Party was something special. And then all of a sudden, these establishment Republicans started to take that phrase and push it to something that it wasn't at the beginning, at the grassroots level. Meanwhile, the left cannot see anything wrong with Black Lives Matter, and the right. I've heard people that I usually think are good people that somehow defend some white supremacists that are supposed to, I don't think most do, but I think I've heard some that I think are supposed to be Christians that somehow defend the white supremacist movement. That may sound ridiculous, but I've heard it from people that it kind of surprises me. Or at the very least, they downplay those issues with the current Tea Party / All Lives Matter Fox News movement. So because there's this much difference and division on these matters, you cannot have a discussion. And that's really what I think the left-right paradigm tries to do. They want to divide people. They want to polarize everything. And so Fox News always takes one side. They never give any of the other sides. CNN always takes one side. They never get. And so people are programmed to think a certain way. So when you have two issues, the left is 100% for Black Lives Matter and sees no problem with it. And the right can't say anything good about it. The right is 100% for All Lives Matter and sees no problem with the movement. And the left gets offended by it. And you cannot have a discussion for the most part. I think a lot of people do, but this is where the media is programming us to go and to divide us. So that leads to the question, what would Jesus do? And there was a similar thing going on in his day, believe it or not. Now, they didn't have the Democrats and Republican parties, but they had leaders of different, the Pharisees and Sadducees. And I don't know if there were more political or different other groups or what they believed or any of that, but I know that they were against each other. And it was not just on a religious level, but on a political level, and they would test Jesus. Because no matter what, both sides hated Jesus, and they both wanted to test him and trap him, basically, so that people would hate him, even if it was just half the people. One example is they came to Jesus and said, is it right for us to pay taxes to Caesar, or is it right for Caesar to tax us? And I guess one of the parties was for it and one party was against it. And Jesus knew they were testing him. But Jesus had a lot of wisdom, and it's very difficult to proclaim the truth and yet not take a side. And somehow he would say something that both sides would walk away speechless, and neither side could rebuke him. And they did this several times. But in this case, Jesus said, let me see a denarius, one of the coins of that day. He said, whose face is on whose face and name is on this? And they said, it's Caesar's. And he goes, therefore give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And neither side could rebuke what he said. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in how to approach these kinds of topics, and I'm trying to learn to be better at this. That is why I try to avoid trigger phrases and words or join movements, because they become so polarized that they're divisive. And it doesn't matter if I think everything on that side is right or 99% right. Usually when there's two staunch views, they both have their points. They both have good reasons why they're on that side. Now, I'd have to admit, if that question was asked to me, I would say absolutely not. We don't need to pay taxes to Caesar as a libertarian. In putting in the modern context of being against the Federal Reserve. And I used to get worked up about that stuff, and unfortunately, there are conspiracy kinds of movements, and even within the Christian community, unfortunately, that basically say they don't have to, there's no law that says they have to pay taxes, and that's between them and God. That's not a fight I'm willing to fight. Because I go back to what Jesus said. He says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's," and that same thing can be, about the dollar bill and Washington is on it, and that's just one of those things that, as I've gotten more mature, I've realized there's certain things that Christians need to avoid and take the higher ground on to be above reproach. And I'm going to give one more example before I get back to the main topic of the Black Lives Matter situation. I remember when getting really into conspiracy type videos that a lot of them would get me worked up, and somebody would be at a border patrol or something, and they would ask them to get out so they can search their car, and these, constitutionalists would say things like, "No, thank you, officer, may I continue?" You don't have the constitutional, the Constitution, does not support you, blah, blah, blah. And you can make that case. But again, and emotionally, I would respond, and thankfully I never did this, because some of these people would get beat up and then they would show it on video, and then I would get worked up and say, yeah, we're under such oppression, and I would get worked up about it. But thankfully I never did, and I've changed my thinking on that issue, because another thing Jesus said was, if a Roman soldier asked you to walk with them 1 mile, go with them 2. I believe I heard somewhere that the max amount of miles they could ask you is 1. So Jesus is saying go above and beyond, be willing to give and not be forced to do, and that's what a Christian should do. So I would like to say, and this is not race based. I'm talking about constitutionalists, that most of them are white, that have been beaten by cops, and it's because they were confrontational. And I have a sense that most police brutality or beatings is because of confrontation, because the person was not cooperating with the police. And this has nothing to do with whether or not I think that the police had the right to do what they were doing, if they were being unconstitutional. But I think a Christian should cooperate. Now, that does not mean, and I will say emphatically, that there are cases in which the person did cooperate and yet still got beaten or killed by the cop. And in this case, cops are definitely wrong. And in some cases, it seems like there's a racial prejudice there. In the case of George Floyd, we don't see any sign of resisting arrest. And even if there was some confrontation, once he was on the ground and in handcuffs, there's no reason that the knee should have continued on the back of the head. So that leads us back to Black Lives Matter and the protests that are happening. And I'm going to do something different, or say something different than I'm seeing on most Christian truth kind of programs or videos, or the conservative movement, even those that claim to be outside of the left-right paradigm and have woken up to the conspiracies and all of that stuff. But it seems that every one of them only have negative things to say about Black Lives Matter, and I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is say that at the grassroots level, it is a good protest, a good movement. And just like I said earlier about the Tea Party, it has been hijacked. But I have friends who were in downtown Dallas doing protests. And I guarantee you, from what I know of these friends, none of them are violent. None of them would throw bombs into a store or do violent riots, set things on fire. None of my friends would do that. They were out there just peacefully protesting. And I believe that just about, most of the people there is what they were doing. That's it. And you could argue about what is appropriate, what is a good form of protesting. People would argue about kneeling at the national anthem and all that stuff. And I have no problem with any of that. I will say that blocking a freeway seems like a dumb way to protest to me, and that might upset people. On the other hand, if people are blocking a freeway, I disagree with police gas spraying them, regardless of whether or not it's against the rules, because they're not setting things on fire or hurting people. But I do reason I think it's stupid is because you're going to get some angry driver just run over them. And I've seen videos of that happen too. And I'm not justifying the driver. I don't think that's the right thing to do either. But you got to think about this, first of all. Many people driving that are trying to get from point A to point B are African Americans. Who are they protesting? That you got to face, I think in any line of protesting, you've got to aim it towards the right people. You got to the message has to be sent to the right direction. And I have a hunch because I know how the enemy works. Whether it's demonically initiated or if it's organized, and I think it's a bit of both. This group like Antifa that comes in, and they're the ones, I think, doing most of the violent stuff. And it's interesting to note that most of the people in Antifa are white. And I think there's people in Antifa that really believe in what they're doing. They're just passionate and emotional and charged and think what they're doing is good. And I can understand this because, like I said, I could get worked up emotionally by conspiracy kind of videos, and I never did anything like that, but I could imagine being in a situation where I would get worked up. So I completely understand. But I think it's organized and led by what I would call controlled opposition. And that is they're trying to destroy the protest and the whole meaning of it by acting like they're a part of it and then raising chaos. But what many on the right are doing and what I refuse to do is equate that with Black Lives Matter. I know that there's people in Black Lives Matter, even my good friends, that have defended the violence, and it's a little, emotional and irrational, but I don't equate them to the violence because I don't believe they would do what they are defending. But I understand why they're defending it because, like I said, I have been worked up myself to where I thought that kind of stuff was justified. Now, it baffles my mind why many people in the truth movement or conspiracy conservatives that have broken free of the left-right paradigm before support Donald Trump, and it blows my mind. And to this day, I heard some crazy things that I really don't understand. And maybe there's more information I'm not aware of, but I can't figure this out, okay, about Donald Trump. In the COVID-19 situation, they said that the shutdowns and pandemics was somehow to capture all the pedophiles out there. And that seemed a little strange to me that it would take all of that to do it. And now there's martial law being enacted by Donald Trump. And I'm opposed to it. I mean, what happened in Washington, D.C. when he appeared at a church, the whole thing seemed unorganized, just so he could take his picture. And there were peaceful protesters there, and they sprayed rubber bullets and gas on these people. And then he takes a picture with his Bible. I mean, that's so hypocritical. It's so wrong, and I can't defend that. And to be completely consistent, the same thing happened in Dallas and many other cities around the country. Now, I think it's a little different if that is aimed towards the violent rioters and people setting buildings on fire. That's a little different. But when you got peaceful protesters not doing anything wrong, you should never spray them. And there was the same situation in Dallas, as I mentioned, and other cities. But in Dallas, the leader, the head of the police chief in Dallas is an African American woman. And I said she needs to be held ever as accountable as Donald Trump. And of course, with the left-right paradigm, people jumped on my case on the left and said I shouldn't compare her to Trump. But all I'm trying to do is be consistent. Now, I will end with this. So I have talked to good African American Christians that go to my church. One of them came out of a history of being a criminal. And he became a Christian and became a painter. And he was just doing his job. This was probably 15, 20 years ago. I don't know exactly. But he was working in a wealthy area in Dallas, and they called the police on him. Now, nothing happened, but he was offended by that. And I can tell you, I do labor. I'm in people's backyards all the time with my job as a pool guy. And not once have I had the police called on me. Not once. I think there was one time there was a security lady that was asking what I was doing there, This was for a public gym or something, and I just told them why I was there, and that was it. So out of 20 plus years of me doing this kind of work, one time somebody was concerned or worried about who I was. And then another man who is very clean cut, African American man who is very clean cut, very quiet, kind, educated Christian man, not confrontational at all. I asked him, it was actually a few months ago, so it was before all this happened. And I said, have you ever been harassed by police? And he said, oh, several times. So as somebody who grew up believing that all this was in the past, that the 60s was terrible and we got way past that, by the 90s, all that was pretty much forgotten, at least in my mind. I've come to realize that it is not the case. And of course, you got these videos out there of people getting beaten and shot that weren't even resisting arrest and happened to be African American. I remember a video of a girl, there was a bunch of kids in a public or a community pool, and it doesn't really matter because in a sense, I think they were disturbing the peace, and so they got kicked out. I really don't know all the details on it, but I did see a video in which a teenage girl was body slammed by a cop and just seemed completely excessive. And of course, that cop got fired the next day. And so I think, as I said, Christians need to be above reproach. I also think people in authority need to be above reproach. That, I also have a white friend, a white male friend who's a cop, and he completely is disgusted by what happened to George Floyd. And he believes that there is racial profiling and there's problems in the police force, and he's sickened by all of it. He believes all that needs to change. And so the more I know, the more I have learned, I've realized, okay, there is racial profiling. There is a problem. And it's not just media hype. These things are really happening, and we've had evidence on videos. And so I don't want to ignore that problem anymore. And what people on the right are doing is they're completely focusing on the negative side of Black Lives Matter and of the riots, and they're missing the whole point, or the unpatriotic kneeling at the national anthem, and they're just completely ignoring the problem, or they're saying it's overhyped by the media, etc. So I'm not taking that stance that most of the conservative conspiracy Christians are taking. I'm going to take what I believe is the right stance.
We will be